Hey, it's Fox from Inferno Fox Gaming. Every generation of gamers will inevitably wax nostalgic and believe the video game generation that they grew up with is the best. We've reached the point currently where many of those that grew up with and played the seventh generation of consoles believe this also was the best game generation. This includes, of course, the likes of the Sony PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360, and the Nintendo Wii. This sort of nostalgic look back paints the past with rose-colored glasses, but I'm here to tell you that those glasses, they aren't rose-colored, they're beige. And this generation isn't as good as people like to romanticize it out to be. While the Nintendo DS and Sony PSP also encompass this generation, I'm going to specifically be focusing on the home consoles. So let's jump right in and talk about why I believe the seventh generation is the most overrated.
And we'll start with what I feel was the worst piece of hardware this console maker had created, the PlayStation 3. Sony was a victim of their own success. They saw an immense amount of said success with the PS2, with sales that, thanks to Jim Ryan, seem to continue to grow to this day. Besides the stellar selection of great video games, reasons for high PS2 sales were the built-in DVD player as well as backwards compatibility with the PS1. Trying to replicate this functionality, the PS3 was announced to not only play CDs and DVDs, but also Blu-rays as well, and having the PS1 and 2 backwards compatibility. Add into this support for SD card, memory stick, compact flash cards, a substantial for its time 60GB hard drive, and Wi-Fi. We saw them reveal all of this at $600, or $500 for the 20GB model. At $935 now, adjusted for inflation, unfortunately no amount of giant enemy crabs exclusive to medieval Japan was going to endear this high cost to consumers. I'd also heard how difficult the cell engine that was built within the PS3 was to develop for.
Add to that an oddly large lack of first-party games at its release, it made the PS3 a not-so-compelling console to get. I also personally had a number of hardware issues with the PS3, specifically running through one Fat Boy model and three Slims. Thank goodness, though, that Sony's warranty program was also on point. Next up is the Xbox 360, and you know exactly where I'm going with them. Probably their biggest issue for this console was absolutely
Peter Molyneux. Seriously though, all this crazy empty promises aside, the infamous Red Ring of Death was by far the issue that stained the Xbox 360's launch. Now, don't get me wrong, there were plenty of things wrong with the 360 when it launched that had nothing to do with this either, and that includes Microsoft and Xbox supporting HD DVD over Sony's Blu-ray, and it's unfortunate for Xbox since Sony did end up winning this particular home media race, and this ended up with the Xbox having DVD-based media, resulting in some multi-disc titles like Blue Dragon, Lost Odyssey, Mass Effect 3, and more. Also, the 360 did not have any built-in Wi-Fi, HDMI ports, and only 20 gigabytes in the hard drive for the launch 360 units. And I've also heard there was an odd habit of the 360 itself scratching game discs if the console itself was moved while it was in use. Going back to our lovely Red Ring of Death issue, this impacted a great majority of the Xbox 360 units due to them repeatedly being heated and cooled, thus causing the connection between the GPU and motherboard to stress and break.
finally, we come to the big N and their wonderful console, the Wii. Now, I'd been a bit rough on Sony and Microsoft on their consoles. Maybe that's because I had grown up being a Nintendo fanboy as a kid and teenager. Regardless of that, I will freely admit that I like the Wii the least, not only out of all the home consoles produced by Nintendo, but also out of the entire seventh generation itself.
I thought it was great the Wii was the first time Nintendo had backwards compatibility with its home consoles, but this was only the case because the Wii is essentially an overclocked GameCube with more RAM. With the power, or lack thereof, that Nintendo had with a system that essentially was from last generation, this could have been a potential factor of why the Wii lacked a number of third-party games that the PS3 and Xbox 360 enjoyed. This also meant that while the PS3 and 360 went high definition, Nintendo opted out of the HD train. While the 360 and the PS3 were rocking with at least 20GB hard drives at launch, the Wii came in with an earth-shattering 512 megabytes of internal storage, roughly half of one single gigabyte. And yeah, virtual console games and save files really didn't take up much space, but this maximum hard drive space really did get filled up quick due to game and other downloads, especially when the WiiWare games really started to roll. Briefly looking at present day, Nintendo really isn't known to have the most robust internet connectability. And why is that? The 7th generation here is a big reason why. Comparing this generation's Xbox Live and what would become the PlayStation Network, Wii's online service was bare bones by comparison, offering little to no player interactivity and difficulty with things like adding friends.
And finally, the biggest issue with the Wii, and my biggest issue with it, is absolutely the motion controls. This was the biggest feature that made it more approachable with general audiences like mom, dad, and grandma, but it was one that I found often the most tedious and imperfect in many ways. It also led to the copycat effect that rippled into the PlayStation and Xbox via the Move and Xbox Connect. I'm going to touch upon this specific topic in a future video at some point, so I'm going to kind of leave it there. But with all of these issues, did these companies do anything to fix said issues?
A year after the PS3's launch, Sony had released an 80GB model listing for $500, the original price of the 20GB launch model. They also introduced a 40GB model for $100 less than that. These price reductions were possible as Sony scaled back a couple hardware items they had on the original launch units, which unfortunately included a specific chipset that allowed PS2 backwards compatibility. Sony also released Uncharted: Drake's Fortune around this time. Doing so gave people reasons to buy and play the PS3, along with future big title games releasing the next year like Little Big Planet, Resistance 2, Wipeout HD, and more. Microsoft themselves knew they'd done f***ed up with the whole Red Ring of Death thing among all of the other issues they had. Not only did they extend their warranty to 3 years, they also covered repair and replacement costs as well as the shipping to and from their customers on affected units. They also issued a public statement addressing this in July 2007 and committed over $1 billion to make things right for their consumers. Most importantly, future hardware corrected this issue. This includes one of their most robust offerings for the time, the Xbox 360 Elite. This bad boy finally had HDMI support, as would all future iterations of the 360, as well as 120 gigabytes in the hard drive, and it was available for $480 in April of 2007. And it would experience further price drops as time quickly moved on, this 120 gigabyte model dropping as low as $250 when the 250 gigabyte model was announced.
So what did Nintendo do to correct their issues? They got worse. For example, a redesign was released at a reduced cost of $150, but without the GameCube backwards compatibility. Future iterations like the Wii Mini kept the lack of GameCube's backward compatibility, but also removed SD card support and an additional USB slot. So, okay, it's evident that mistakes were made, but there were real efforts made by both Microsoft and Sony. This includes correcting the mistakes that were made, as well as fixing the course of the generation itself to provide consoles and products overall that appealed to the video gaming customer. It's also evident that Nintendo went the other direction and made the Wii even worse, but they also committed another cardinal sin: complacency.
As the PS3 and 360 saw the same console but with more options, like larger hard drives being released, the Wii never saw an expansion of the existing 512 megabyte model released during its lifetime. In the latter half of Wii's lifetime did see less output of first-party games, while the shovelware just kept piling and piling on. Nintendo and its partners got quite excessive with the crazy amount of accessories too, up to and including the Wii Balance Board, Wii Wheel, Wii Zapper, Wii Motion Plus adapters, and 2 different versions of the Wii Classic controller, and much more. It could be argued that this overall complacency and lack to continue to innovate led to the creation of the Wii U, which was itself a poorly marketed and branded machine. Nintendo felt the Wii U was compelling enough to keep the general audience they gained with the Wii, while also attracting hardcore gamers with its first foray into HD gaming. But by attempting to do both, they ended up splitting the difference and avoided attracting them both.
Now I laid out some of the history that clearly points that all 3 of the console makers had their various issues with these systems. This, of course, is an inevitable problem for every single generation of consoles as we know it.
The second, from 76 to 83, had quality issues with the games themselves, ultimately leading to the North American video game crash of 1983. The third, from 84 to 91, dealt with constraints with production supplies such as chip shortages. The fifth, from 94 to 2000, saw the move from 2D to 3D, thus causing a large swath of games that aged poorly. And heck, the ninth and current gen repeated history with the supply chain issues, and saw the PS5 in particular launch in an environment that was exceedingly difficult to get and obtain.
And to be fair, for those of you that are still hanging around, there are a number of really great games from this generation. And in honor of that particular argument, I've changed the video quality here to match this generation. That's right, we are now in the wonderful sepia tone that is so synonymous with the 7th generation of video games.
This may have been due to the developers muting the overall color palettes to avoid highlighting imperfections in the console's rendering capabilities. Also, everything had to have had that sense of realism and thus portrayed more subdued and gritty visual styles. Japan game developers trying too hard to bridge the gap to the Western markets around this time is a great example of this. Also, popular game series of the time often heeded to a sepia art style, like Gears of War, Fallout 3, Call of Duty, Oblivion, and more, many having post-apocalyptic or war-type settings.
Thankfully, Nintendo didn't adopt this color style quite as often, with one of the exceptions being Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. Though, again, this was the only home console that wasn't HD, doing games like Super Mario Galaxy quite a disservice. Also,
most bangers from the 7th generation are available under current gen options that probably run better now anyway. This includes stuff like Last of Us, Uncharted, Red Dead Redemption, Grand Theft Auto 5, and more. Of course, we've yet to see games like Metal Gear Solid 4, the Resistance and Infamous series, or RPG gems like Lost Odyssey or Blue Dragon be ported or remastered to the current gen. It should be noted that this was the first generation where all the main consoles had their own digital storefronts. So you have this generation to thank for the beginning of the end of physical media, as well as the start of video games releasing in incomplete form, since the manufacturers and devs know they can just update it later digitally. Now, in fairness, the other side of the digital coin is that this is also the first generation that modernized online gameplay. Okay, true, the previous one had it with stuff like the GameCube and PS2 modems and the genuinely excellent gameplay on hits like Halo 2 for the OG Xbox, but it was the 7th gen that online connection itself to play with others was the norm. While Xbox required players to pay with the Xbox Live Gold subscriptions, good guy Sony and Nintendo didn't require this with their online connectivity. Sony's online connections weren't as robust as what Microsoft offered for its Xbox players, and this included multiple outages and connectivity issues on the Sony side, as well as lag and latency during gameplay itself. With Sony's connections, download speeds themselves weren't as quick, and they didn't offer near as many incentives as to what Microsoft did with Xbox Live Gold. Oh, and while we're on the Sony train, let's not forget the infamous security breach in May 2011 when the PSN was down for 23 days and over 77 million accounts were impacted. And Nintendo's online service was anything but robust for the time. It was fine for online Mario Kart and Call of Duty Black Ops, I guess.
now there's nothing that can take away the the many fond memories we have of generations of video games that we grew up with. But it's also important that we look back to the past in a realistic way so as not to lose ourselves in a romanticized falsehood. The seventh generation was one that broke a lot of ground, had a lot of fantastic games, but was very flawed thanks in part to questionable business decisions by the big three. It's important to remember that the past, both the good and the bad, so that we can make sure that as consumers, we hold these companies accountable.
After all, this kind of accountability and our voices as consumers are so very important to impacting the video game industry. Some examples of this include making Xbox backtrack on its DRM and Xbox Connect requirement policies for the Xbox One when that was preparing to launch in 2013. Also, stopping Sony from closing the PS3, PSP, and PS Vita stores in 2021. And the backlash to, do you guys not have phones? Blizzard announcing the mobile game Diablo Immortal in 2018. While that game did ultimately release to minimal fanfare, they did turn their shit around and announce Diablo 4. Good guys Blizzard, right? There weren't any core changes with that game upon release or anything.
Now, let me know what you think in the comments section below. Is the seventh generation your favorite of all time? Do you look at it with rose colored glasses or do you maintain a more realistic sepia tone for it? Either way, thanks again for watching and have a great day.